Vous avez fini? Avete finito? Benissimo. Now that you have thrown all the projectiles in your vicinity at me, I'm going to do the cowardly thing and walk back the statement I just made. Here I'm just talking about vocabulary, but in a very real sense. If we just talk about vocabulary, and I must say a specific limited set of vocabulary, it is fair to say that Spanish and Portuguese are older than French and Italian. And this doesn't seem at all particularly intuitive because, of course, if you look at a map, it looks as though geographically Spain and Portugal are a lot further away than France and Italy are from Rome, right? But there is a good reason I'm saying this, because yes, though all of the societies that speak Romance languages now were Latinized and Romanized by the Roman Empire, this process occurred at different times throughout history. And it happens that it occurred in Spain and Portugal pretty early. And in order to understand that, we need to go back a little bit in history. So you see, in 218 BC, the Romans had a serious problem. Probably one of the greatest generals of all time, Hannibal Barca, really had a strong grudge against them. He'd sworn on his father's deathbed that he would avenge Carthage's defeat at the hands of the Romans in the First Punic War some decades earlier. And as he was crossing over into Italy with his elephants, you could say he needed their help to get there. The Romans came up with a clever counter-strategy. They decided to send their general, Scipio Africanus, to the Iberian Peninsula. Why the Iberian Peninsula? Well, the Carthaginian Empire was a maritime commercial empire that had its center in modern-day Tunisia. Right, the city of Carthage was in modern-day Tunisia. And they had conquered, they'd brought under their control certain cities, coastal cities in the Iberian Peninsula. Keep that in mind because I'd love to do a video in the future on the Carthaginian Phoenician remnants evident in modern-day Iberian Romance place names, but that's for another day. Anyway, it goes without saying that Rome ultimately won and Scipio Africanus was successful in this process. But what this meant was that Latinization began pretty early in the Iberian Peninsula relative to when it occurred in France and in modern-day Italy, right? Now, what this means is that the Latin that was spoken at that time was the sort of Latin that was spread across the Iberian Peninsula. And the Latin that was spoken at that time is what we call pre-classical Latin. When we usually think of Latin, we think of Julius Caesar, we think of Virgil, Cicero, all those kind of great poets and authors. But they spoke what we would call, and they wrote in what we would call classical Latin. What Scipio Africanus and his soldiers, and then the later settlers and merchants who inhabited the Iberian Peninsula and Romanized the Iberian Peninsula, spoke was pre-classical Latin. So this means that the Iberian Romance languages adopted some pretty early Latin words, right? From our perspective, pretty early Latin words. And I want to give you a few examples because this is super interesting. If you know even part of one Romance language, you'd be interested in this. And if you know more, you'd be even more so. The very first one I want to use is that very common expression that we use, that students love using every time you ask how they are. Estoy cansado. In Spanish, estou cansado in Portuguese. In Spanish and Portuguese, we've got this adjective, cansado, comes from cansar in both languages. That derives from the verb campsare, which was an early Greek borrowing into pre-classical Latin, but which is not found in literature after the 2nd century BC. And that's why when we speak in French, we would say je suis fatigué or sono stanco in Italian, right? They take a completely different word for both of those expressions. Another one in Spanish, cueva, cave, cova in Portuguese. That comes from the pre-classical Latin adjective, cova, which just meant something hollow, right? So cova as a Latin adjective would just qualify a noun, telling us that that particular noun is hollow. In time, it evolved into cava, which is where we get the French cave from. But Spanish and Portuguese keep that older form. One that I really like is the possessive pronoun, cuyo in Spanish, cujo in Portuguese. And that comes from cujus in Latin, which was basically obsolescent from my understanding in the 1st century BC. Además in Spanish, ademais in Portuguese, besides, in addition to, as well as. That's not found in writing after the 2nd century BC, and that's why Italian might have something like inoltre, and French would have its own equivalents as well, right? And then the one really interesting thing that's fundamental to when you learn a language is the word for speak, right? So we know that I hablo español and falo portugués, but somehow, very clearly, the French and Italian versions are related. Parlo italiano, je parle français, right? Now, that's because the Spanish and the Portuguese come from the Latin fabulare, which is a metaphor for telling a fable, telling a story, conversing. And that's something that disappeared, wasn't really found in Latin after the 1st century BC. And then the final one, that's probably my favorite, because it's an example of semantic conservatism. And this one, my favorite one, is querer in Spanish, querer in Portuguese. If I were to say te quiero in Spanish, it means I like you, right? If I say quiero unos tacos, I want some tacos. It has this connotation, this meaning of desire, to want, to like, or to even, in its strongest sense, to love something. And that's because it comes from the Latin, the pre-classical querere. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is that querere never disappeared. Actually, querere continued, but it changed its meaning. So querere after, or in the classical period, querere came to mean to seek something, right? To look for something, to search for something. But that older sense is actually conserved in Spanish and Portuguese, and I would assume in most other Iberian Romance. Let me know about that. And that's the only instance I can think of where you have semantic conservatism. So you've got like the meaning of a word is maintained in its original form or in its original connotation, and it's kind of like ossified, cemented in one particular language. And interestingly enough, it's the meaning of querere that we see the poet Terence use. If you guys have any other examples of this kind of semantic conservatism across the Romance languages, I'd be really interested. Like, is there a word, is there some term in French or Italian that you don't see, that you see in the other languages, but just has a completely different, more conservative meaning? I'd be really interested to find that out, because I'm sure there are tons, but none that come to my mind immediately. As always, I've been speaking in fairly linguistically imprecise terms. I might as well state now that I don't generally like to write scripts. I prefer to kind of speak off the cuff with a few notes by the side, because otherwise it just doesn't come across as natural. I've tried with scripts and it just feels weird. So if I've made any mistakes, please correct me. You know that I will pin the most, I'll definitely respond to corrections, and I'll definitely pin the most kind of, the most comprehensive correction there. For now though, I will atone for my previous sins, say au revoir, merci beaucoup, and arrivederci, ciao, a presto.